I'm Lucy Harvey. I'm here with former Chief Accountant of the SEC, Lynn Turner. We're doing an oral history for the Securities and Exchange Historical Society on the founding of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. We're here in Washington, D.C. It is Monday, February 10th, 2020. Lynn, thanks for joining me this morning.
Good to be here, Lucy. Thank you for inviting me.
Lynn, this is your second oral history for this society. The first one you did was June 16th, 2005, and that really focused on your early career at Coopers & Lybrand, your time as an SEC accounting fellow, and your time as the chief accountant at the SEC. But this history is going to focus on how you helped to structure what became Sarbanes-Oxley and how you helped to establish the PCAOB. So I'm first going to ask you about 1991 during your tenure as the SEC accounting fellow, and you would help then to begin writing legislation that would regulate the audit profession. So describe a little bit about that.
There were some issues the Commission had, as well as Congress had, with the accounting profession at that point in time, had for a number of years. And the House committee that oversaw the SEC at the time, the Commerce Committee, was chaired by Congressman Jack Dingell from Michigan. And he called us, the staff, up to the Hill to have a meeting with the leadership of the accounting profession to talk about what needed to be done. So myself and the general counsel from the chief accountant's office, Robert Burns, went up to meet with the congressional staff, including Consuelo Washington, who was chief counsel to Jack Dingell and the committee at the time, representative staff from Representative Wyden's office, Representative Markey's office, and the leadership of the profession were all there. We had a discussion. As a result of that discussion, the profession wasn't excited about further regulation, but Consuelo Washington asked Robert Burns and I to draft legislation, which we did. It was what became Section 10A of the Securities Act that laid out specific things that auditors had to do and legislated that. So in a way, it was a forerunner for what would come later on, about 10 years later on, when the Enrons and WorldComs blew up.
The next time that you got involved in regulation of audit firms was when you were then chief accountant. And so fast forward for us into 1998 and describe that scene for us.
By 1998, the corporate scandals had started to evolve. There were situations like Cendant and others that had come to light. The chairman of the SEC at the time was out speaking about it. That was Arthur Levitt. And so there was clearly an issue with audits and the quality of audits. I came in as the chief accountant in July of '98, and Chairman Levitt had wanted to do a major public policy address. So right off the bat, that was really the first thing that I became involved with as chief accountant, and it was to come up with a program to deal with the issues that the Commission was seeing with the quality of audits.
You talked a little bit about the famous numbers speech that you helped to write.
Yeah, the numbers game speech that Chairman Levitt gave. It was probably one of the best known speeches coming out of the Commission. Certainly it was probably the widest distributed speech. Became quite the topic, was on the front page of many of the newspapers, and it set forth a 9-point program. Part of it would be done by the Commission and the staff. Part of it would be done by the accounting regulator, the FASB, part by the American Institute of CPAs and their various bodies. And then we also set up a couple commissions or committees to look at issues, one of which became known as the OMalley Panel, which a couple years later in August of 2000 would issue a report with a number of significant recommendations on how to redo the regulatory oversight of the profession.
Also at this time, Chairman Levitt wanted to make a major ruling on auditor independence.
Yes. Within 2 weeks of when I became chief accountant, the SEC staff came into my office with an anonymous letter that had been sent by someone to our Miami office. And it discussed a number of extremely disturbing issues with respect to PricewaterhouseCoopers and auditors' independence, involving one of their offices in Florida, but also describing that it was a broader problem, if you will, in terms of auditor independence. And that led to a major SEC enforcement action against PwC that I believe first got issued in January of 1999, but over the course of that investigation and project, we found thousands, 8,000 to 10,000 auditor violations just within PwC. Gave us a pretty good indication that there were other problems at other firms in the profession, not to pick on PwC, because I certainly don't think they were any different than any of the rest of them. And as that moved forward and went on, we decided that we really did need to redo the auditor independence rules at the commission. They'd first been written in 1933, the year before the SEC even came into being by the Federal Trade Commission, and there'd been no complete top to bottom update from 33 to 99. And so in January of 2000 in San Diego, at a major SEC conference, actually chaired, I think, by former Commissioner David Reuter, I went out and did a major speech that announced that we were going to go into rulemaking. I remember that speech very well because right after it, David Reuter came up to me and he said, "Whoa, this is going to be big," and probably turned out to be bigger than what most people thought at the time.
Also, were some of the firms interested in finding a path to sell their consulting practices?
There were. In fact, again, right after I got to the commission, probably August of 1998, KPMG had approached us trying to find a pathway to dispose or sell a portion, is probably a better way to put it at that point in time. They wanted to sell a portion of their consulting practice to Cisco and wanted to find a path for doing that. And so they came in and started to talk to us. The next one to come in would be Ernst & Young and their CEO, Phil Laskaway, and his general counsel. And we began conversations with them. Initially, PricewaterhouseCoopers was adamant that they didn't want to do that and oppose any such move. In fact, Harvey Goldsmith, who was general counsel and would later become a commissioner and embroiled in the PCAOB establishment, Harvey and I met with PwC at LaGuardia Airport in December of '98, at which time PwC expressed that there was no way that they would ever support the firm's spinning off or selling their consulting practices. And that was most fascinating because once the SEC enforcement action hit the press that I mentioned to you before, they had a number of large companies that they audited, some of the biggest, come to them and say as a result of that enforcement action, their lack of independence, they were considering changing or switching auditors. So in the middle of February of '99, Arthur and I got a call from PwC, a very urgent call saying that the leadership of that firm needed to meet with us, which we did do in Arthur's conference room in Washington, D.C. And they said, as a result of the fallout from that, they were going to announce publicly, and in fact ran a full-page ad inside the front section of the Wall Street Journal announcing that they decided it was the right thing to do to get rid of the consulting. And keep in mind, this is just, like less than 2 months after they told us over their dead body would they ever do this, but the pressure was so high on them as a result of the enforcement action that they decided to do that, and later on would do it. And in that Wall Street Journal article, they actually said getting rid of the consulting was the right thing to do as an audit firm.
So now you're in the mindset that you want to get the profession to accept the OMalley Panel recommendations. So describe that effort.
We had, as part of the numbers game speech, agreed to set up this panel of 9 to 10 people, chaired by the former PwC CEO, Sean O'Malley, to look at the effectiveness of audits and the quality of audits. They really got into that by early 1999, worked on that, and were headed and came out with recommendations in August of 2000. As the same time that is occurring, we are also talking to a number of the large firms about spinning off their consulting practices. We mentioned KPMG, we mentioned PricewaterhouseCoopers, Ernst & Young. We spent considerable time with them, and that became extremely important because when Phil Laskaway called us up at the commission, called Arthur and asked would we negotiate a pathway for them to be able to sell their consulting practice, which they ultimately did to a firm out of Europe called Capgemini. We asked something in return, and that was for Phil and his general counsel, Catherine, to work with us drafting legislation that would create a better regulatory framework for the auditing profession, especially if they're all going to be selling their consulting practice. And so as we had those discussions with Phil during '99 into 2000, we went back and picked up a piece of legislation that had initially been drafted and introduced during the latter half of the '70s in the Moss and Metcalf committees in Congress. And then had been picked back up by Congressman Markey in '95 as Congress worked on the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act, or PSLRA. And it was discussed by Congress then, but ultimately didn't make it into PSLRA. Section 10 of the Securities Act had gotten in, but not the legislation actually creating a regulatory body. And so Phil worked with us on drafting a new regulatory framework that was legislative, and we got it moved fairly far along, but never completed it, never thought it would go anyplace. This is happening at the same time as the OMalley Panel recommendations are being drafted, and we're intimately involved with that. Sean and his committee, which included former SEC Commissioner Beavis Longstreth, come out with their recommendations in 2000. This is while we're also doing all the revision of the Auditor Independence rules, so it was a busy time at the commission. But we thought the OMalley panel had some good recommendations, so we went to each of the 5 major firms at the time and discussed with them the possibility of putting those recommendations in place. And we got an agreement of all of the firms but one, Deloitte and Touche. I remember calling their CEO at the time, and he referred me, he said that decision as to whether we would or would not agree to that will be made actually by a partner who was a former SEC staffer, had been a professional accounting fellow, Bob Kipper, a wonderful guy. But I talked to Bob, and Bob said that their firm couldn't agree to the OMalley panel recommendations, that the changes in the regulation, including how auditing standards would be set, the power of the Oversight board, we were going to try to keep the then existing Public Oversight Board. We thought that was a good vehicle, that we needed to make modifications, but not start over from scratch. And like I said, 4 of the 5 agreed, but Deloitte would not agree to it. This is towards the end of 2000, just as we're coming to the conclusion of the Auditor Independence rulemaking. Deloitte had vehemently opposed us on that. Deloitte wanted to keep their consulting practice. They were the only firm that was keeping their consulting practice. All the others had decided to spin them off or dispose of them somehow. So I think the other firms were in a position to agree, but Deloitte, the one who would not ever sell off their consulting practice, the only one, opposed it. And so that made it difficult to see the road forward at that point in time as to what was going to happen.
So then we have the November 2000 election. Bush is elected. Arthur Levitt announces that he's leaving, and you make a decision to leave. What's happening then?
We're continuing to see issues with the auditing profession. We had a major SEC enforcement action ongoing inside the commission with respect to a company called Waste Management. Their auditors, Arthur Anderson. We would eventually bring fraud charges against Anderson in July of 2001. And as part of that enforcement action, we got an injunction against Arthur Anderson in which they agreed never to do that again and never to commit fraud. And that got filed with the court in July, I believe, of 2001, just a month before I was going to leave. And just about a month before Anderson would, in essence, violate that injunction again with their audit of Enron. And it was the Waste Management enforcement action that then gave the Department of Justice the basis for going after Anderson and Enron. So we're still having all these problems with the quality of audits and concerns about whether or not there needed to be some revised or new regulatory structure put in place. And that would then come back to the forefront at that November 2001 SEC Issues conference that was here in Washington, D.C.
Let me take a minute. So you've left.
Yes.
You've left the commission in August 2001.
That's correct.
What happens 3 weeks after you leave Washington, D.C.?
9/11 hits, most unfortunate situation, creates a whole new environment for the country, needless to say. And of course, Harvey Pitt is coming in as the new SEC commissioner. Harvey had been very closely aligned with the accounting firms. He had been their outside legal counsel on a number of issues. He had put together a document on Auditor's Independence that was submitted to the then Independent Standards Board, or ISB, while I was, or just before I became chief accountant, in which he espoused the view that the SEC needed to, quote, lighten up on the rules. And shortly after we left, I actually had a lunch with Harvey Pitt just before I left the commission, and Harvey and I talked quite extensively about the auditing profession. And I think Harvey agreed that there needed to be some reforms, but because Arthur and I had battled so much over independence and the corporate scandals with the profession, he wanted to see if he couldn't find a way to get the profession to come around and agree with him on some of this stuff, which was, I think, not a bad idea if he could do it. He went out and did a major speech in October of 2001 that got discussed a lot in the New York Times, in which Harvey went and said the SEC needed to be friendlier with the auditing profession. And I'm not sure the press fully understood what Harvey was trying to get at that point in time, but it definitely came out the wrong way in the media. That was October. Then the November conference.
Enron hits October 15th. Right?
Yeah, yes, there's a major conference call. There's an earnings conference call that Enron has in August that doesn't go well. Jeff Skilling leaves as CEO or as president of Enron, and then Ken Lay, the founder, steps back in as CEO and chairman. Andy Fastow as CFO is on that phone call in October, and it goes extremely terrible. There's two major investment funds, a Highfields and a Kennecos, that get on the phone and highlight the problems with Enron and that it's kind of a shell game and a sham. It goes horribly wrong, and then everything starts to go south very quickly. In fact, from the middle of October to the end of the first week in December, it's less than 2 months before it was the 7th largest company in the United States is in bankruptcy. In between that, from October to December, is the SEC Majors Issues Conference that Senator Sarbanes and myself are both speaking at, and we actually get together then after we'd both spoken at that conference.
Okay, and they started to talk to you and said, what are we going to do about this, right?
Yes, so Senator Sarbanes, the night after dinner at that conference, and I speak along with his staff, Chief of Staff in the Senate Banking Committee, Steve Harris. And Senator Sarbanes asked if I would help them set up a series of hearings, help with drafting legislation, which I agreed to do. And I mentioned to Sarbanes that there had been this legislation that had been drafted in late 70s, 77, 78, that Congressman Markey had worked on in 95, that we had worked on with Ernst & Young while I was at the commission, and that could provide a good basis for where we may want to go. And so he was aware of that. From that point forward, then I went back home in response to the senator's request, had further phone calls with Steve Harris, who was marvelous to work with, and we set up 10 days of hearings, and we mapped out the topics and who we get as speakers. I started drafting, taking the old legislation that I'd seen while I was at the commission, taking that and working on crafting that and turning it into a piece of legislation that could actually be introduced by someone, and worked on that throughout November and December. I circulated it to 5 people that I consider to be very knowledgeable in this area. A former deputy chief accountant of mine, Jane Adams, the SEC chief accountant before me, who had also run the national office at Deloitte, Mike Sutton, Beavis Longstreth, a partner at Debevoise and Plimpton, who had been an SEC commissioner under Reagan, Charles Boucher, who had for 15 years been the Reagan-appointed comptroller of the U.S., head of the GAO, and was then current chairman of the Public Oversight Board, and finally Harvey Goldsmith, law professor at Columbia, who had also been an SEC general counsel and was soon to be again an SEC commissioner at the time frame the PCAOB, Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, was initially created. Sent the draft legislation out to all of them, got comments back from them, some great comments. I remember comments back from Harvey Goldsmith on the section that set fines and penalties, and Harvey had me change that to pretty much exactly as it is in the final SOX legislation. So that was a useful process. There were hearings starting in December on Enron, and then in January, all of a sudden that switched, and for the first time, the Senate started to hold hearings on Enron as well as the scandal just erupted.
Did you get calls from other congressional offices who were saying, can you help us with legislation?
I did. The first one to call was Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois. And he had a staff person who was marvelous by the name of Jimmy Williams. And they called and asked if I could help them in any way with legislation. And oh, by the way, I had this piece of draft legislation by then. And so I shared it with them. And then they started to work very hard on it right off the bat once they got it. They gave it to the Legislative Drafting Council over in the Senate, a lady by the name of Laura Ayud, who was absolutely marvelous. And Jimmy and Laura and I spent time on the telephone going through the draft, and what came out of that was a piece of legislation that Dick Durbin could carry around to other senators looking for a co-sponsor and or introduce. But Durbin wasn't on the Senate Banking Committee, who would have jurisdiction, so it would be tough for him to get anything introduced. And about a month after he called, then I got a call from the staff of Senator Dodd from Connecticut and Corzine from New Jersey, and their staff, and Alex Sternhill and a Roger Hollingsworth. And Roger and Alex asked if I had a piece of legislation they could use or work with, and it was like, oh, by the way, we have this piece and Laura has it. And so then I started to work with them. In Senator Durbin's piece, it had a provision calling for mandatory auditor rotation. Senator Dodd couldn't support that because a number of the CEOs of the big firms were in his state and vehemently opposed it. So they took it, recrafted that. They asked me, in fact, I remember the call very well because I was driving home from Colorado State University where I worked, and they asked if I could come up with legislation or language on auditor independence that could replace the mandatory rotation. And they had liked what Arthur and I had proposed at the commission, a year earlier or whatever in this regard. So I went back and we lifted the original SEC proposal on auditor independence from 2000 and put it in word for word into the draft of SOX, and that is word for word how it eventually came out in Sarbanes-Oxley. And it was directly from that original 2000 proposal. So we put that in, got the legislation done. Senator Dodd and Corzine got 2 or 3 other co-sponsors on the bill, and they then introduced that into the Senate Banking Committee, I think somewhat to the consternation of Senator Sarbanes and Steve Harris, because they'd hoped that the fellow Democratic senators on the Senate Banking Committee would wait till they got further along with the 10 days of hearings, which commenced in the first week or so of February and went through March of 2002, but nonetheless it got introduced. I'd also gotten calls from Congressman LaFalce from upstate New York in the House, who was the ranking member on the House Financial Services Committee. He wanted to come up with something, asked for help. Senator or Congressman Dingell, who was chairing the Commerce Committee at the time, wanted to come up with something. A representative from Denver, who I knew very well from my home state by the name of Diana DeGette, wanted to do something. So I came back and met with them and their staff and came up with legislation that they all introduced over in the House, although they were in the minority. So whatever was going to happen in the House ultimately wouldn't come from them. It would come from Congressman Michael Oxley, who was working with the SEC Chairman Pitt and the auditing profession to come up with kind of a lighter touch, if you will, consistent somewhat with the OMalley Panel recommendations, whereas the Senate version that we had drafted had moved beyond the OMalley Panel recommendations, and the draft that Senator Durbin had and Senator Dodd and Corzine and their co-sponsors had did away, in essence, with the OMalley Panel recommendations. They got set to a side, and it created a whole brand new public company accounting oversight board. So it was going down a much different path in the Senate versus the lighter touch in the House, if you will.
And Senator Sarbanes was still not asking you for legislation. They were really waiting till the hearings went through and they could learn all that they wanted to, and then they were going to jump in, right?
Yes, and I think that was a sound game plan. We could have draft legislation, but as we went through the 10 days of hearings, the last day at the end of March was to be Harvey Pitt, and to provide him an opportunity to speak of what he thought should be done, his lighter touch approach. But with Senators Dodd and Corzine introducing it, kind of threw a wrench in it, if you will. Now, Senator Sarbanes didn't introduce anything. And in fact, at some point in time, probably later on in February, I do get a call from Arthur Levitt and then I think Steve Harris about legislation. And at that point in time, then provided a copy of the legislation to Steve and the committee staff, who were top-notch. They had a great team put together working on it. By that point in time, they had Gary Gensler, former Deputy Secretary of Treasury who had worked a lot on Wall Street involved. Gary is just so astute. They have Chuck Bowser that they're working with, again, Comptroller of the U.S. They have Stanley Sporkin, the former Director of Enforcement at the SEC, involved. So they're really hoping to get through a lot more of the hearings and then start drafting, but with this Dodd and Corzine bill gets introduced, then their pressure is on them to go do something. We give them a draft. I actually didn't reach out to anyone to give them a draft. I just waited for the phone calls to come in, and then I would deliver the draft. And Sarbanes and Harris knew back from the November discussion that I had a draft, but they hadn't looked for it yet because of the process we were going through. But when they do ask for it, we give them a copy. By that point in time, it's gone through a number of iterations of drafting with Laura Yu, the person who ultimately would be the staff person in the congressional staff who would draft and approve the draft. And they reach out to her, work with her on it, and then we're going through the hearings. So we're hearing more and the legislation starts to get built out. Additional pieces get attached to it.
Some of the people you said they were also working with Marty Grunberg and Steve Kroll.
Yeah, the Senate Banking Committee staff were really top notch. Marty Grunberg, you might recognize, is subsequent to all of this, he becomes a board member and then chair of the FDIC. Steve Kroll, top notch, would eventually join the staff of the PCAOB several years later.
Dean
Shahinian was, Dean might have actually been the best of all the staff. He was, and people like Dean and all had been around for other major pieces of legislation like Fiducia and FIREA, as had Steve Harris. So these people had gone through this process and seen really how to do a successful piece of legislation. And the country was just, quite frankly, very fortunate to have had all of them there at one place, along with all the outside help that got put into it.
Now you're telling me about they started to circulate it in the middle of April, but Sarbanes wants to make sure that he gets some votes. Describe that.
Yeah. So they do start to circulate it and circulate it broadly. It wasn't something they tried to hide from people, so a lot of people had it. Senator Sarbanes wanted to take it to a vote in the committee before Memorial Day at the end of May. And when he starts talking to the fellow senators on the committee, he finds two of the Democrats aren't supportive. Senator Birchby and Zell Miller from, is it Zell Miller? Yeah, from Georgia. Mm-hmm. And he definitely has to pick up their votes, and they both want some modifications. Evan Bayh wanted something that would give
Birchby, his dad.
Yes, it is Evan. Yes, excuse me. So Bayh wants a provision in the bill that would allow the PCAOB to exempt audit firms from the Auditor Independence rules, which seemed to be a little strange. Zell Miller wanted the same and some other modifications that could easily be done. What they wanted on the Auditor Independence was a little bit tougher and really inconsistent with why we have audits to start with. So I was speaking to the Alberta Securities Commission at that point in time, up in Canada. I remember it was in the hotel up there when I got the call. And I told the staff, Shahinian and Kroll and Steve Harris were all on the phone call. I told them I thought we could do something consistent with what was already in the securities laws, use the same type of language, and that gave the commission the ability to exempt on a case-by-case basis if it did a finding that it was in the public interest, and they could demonstrate that, and they went through a formal process to reach that conclusion on a case-by-case, not wholesale broad exemptive, then that could work, because that language already was in the laws for the SEC to do. So we put that language in, picked up both senators' votes. Senator Sarbanes had announced he was going to go to a vote in the Senate Banking Committee before Memorial Day, had to delay it to pick up their votes and work out the differences. We had that done over that weekend, and so the following week, Senator Sarbanes said he was bringing SOX to a vote of the Senate Banking Committee.
Then he wants to pick up some Republican votes, right?
Yeah, Senator Enzi, who had been negotiating on behalf of the auditing profession. He was an accountant from Gillette, Wyoming. So he was negotiating for the auditing firms and profession. Came and told Senator Sarbanes that he thought he could get 4 Republican votes if Senator Sarbanes would agree to a number of amendments to what had been drafted. One of those was huge, a big ticket item. And again, I was speaking to a group of Hewlett-Packard financial executives in Monterey, California, when I got a call from Senator Sarbanes in the morning and Steve Harris. They said that what Enzi wanted was a change to the procedures for enforcement actions against the auditing firm. Those actions are done in the public domain, public setting at the SEC. They're called Rule 102E proceedings, and it's all done publicly. The Commission have been doing that for decades. And NC in the auditing profession didn't like that, and so they pushed Sarbanes to agree to allow the PCOB to keep those all under wraps and private. That's why Sarbanes had called me that morning. I pleaded with him not to do that. I said, especially in light of what was happening, how the SEC did it, that was bad policy and bad precedence. He also called Harvey Goldsmith that same morning, who had helped me with the drafting earlier on, and asked Harvey, and Harvey, and I talked about it afterwards, Harvey had pleaded with him again not to do it. But Senator Sarbanes really, really wanted those 4 Republican votes and gave Enzi what Enzi was asking for. And that has been a terrible decision, terrible outcome in policy. Congress is still trying to walk that back to this day, and has allowed the firms to hide behind that shield of darkness, if you will, when they've done bad things on audits.
So now Daschle is thinking he's going to bring this to the Senate, but doesn't exactly know when. He thinks he's going to put it off until June, right?
Actually, till September.
Right.
Senator Daschle, who's the Senate leader at the time, we'd gotten it passed. It had been marked up in the vote taken in the Senate Banking Committee. They actually ended up getting, I believe, 6 votes on the Republican side instead of 4. And so very bipartisan. But Daschle tells us he doesn't think he'll bring it to a vote until September after the summer recess. He does, and the reason for that is in April of 2002, Congressman Oxley and the House Financial Services Committee have passed legislation that is the very much lighter touch, more of the OMalley Panel type approach to regulation. And Daschle doesn't know if he'd be able to pick up enough votes in Congress to get the Sarbanes style legislation through. As I recall, he said he could get us 70 votes or something, but wasn't sure. And so the game plan at that point in time is not to bring it back to the vote of the whole Senate till after the summer recess into September.
So you go fishing.
Absolutely. My time for an annual fishing trip on the Green River with a bunch of the former SEC staff. We do it each year, and great group of guys and trip. And I remember it clearly because I'm thinking nothing's going to happen. Good time to go fishing. We're up in the mountains, and on a Wednesday,
middle of July, I'm driving back from the Green River in Utah. It's June.
Yeah. And it is July. It's the middle part of July when I come back or no, maybe you're right.
June 25th.
Yeah, okay, then you're right. Yep. So we come back, and I'm driving out of the mountains. Don't have cell phone service until we break into an open area along one of the major interstates, and then all of a sudden my phone just starts ping, bing, bing, just pinging, and I can't figure out what's wrong with my phone the way it's pinging, and pick it up and take a phone call and learn that WorldCom has broke that morning, and that changed everything as far as this legislation is concerned. At that point in time, with WorldCom blowing up, the president has gone out and said, I want legislation on my desk by the end of July. I don't want this to linger. It gives an impetus for Daschle to bring it to a vote in the Senate and debate on the floor of the Senate, which he does. What becomes the Sarbanes-Oxley Act overwhelmingly gets approved after having amendments made that bring in all the heavy-duty penalties for violating the laws. There's other sections added on, and voila. At that point in time, we now have the full Sarbanes-Oxley bill for the most part in the Senate, a dramatically different bill out of the House, and the two go to conference. But as a result of WorldCom, which if we had known earlier on by Memorial Day, then we wouldn't have had to negotiate with NZ. But because of WorldCom, there's just a huge outcry amongst the public to go do something, and something very significant. The House and the Senate set up a conference committee. Going into that conference committee, the Senate Dems had decided they were not going to accept Oxley's bill, thought there was enough public sentiment not to go that route, that they could stand their ground, not accept amendments. In fact, there were 52 amendments that were submitted to the House Senate Conference Committee from all walks of life, from the auditing profession, the Chamber of Commerce, even the British Embassy had submitted an amendment they wanted made. But in the end, really none of those amendments got made, nothing of substance. Senate stood their ground and held their ground. Oxley had not yet given in, so the Democrats, by towards the last week of July, had decided to have a big rally on the steps of the House office buildings. All the major media was there for that. And the night before that happened, Auxley called Sarbanes late in the night, early in the morning, and agreed to accept Senator Sarbanes' version of the bill, and did ask if his name could be on it, and hence that's how we got the name Sarbanes-Oxley. Senator Sarbanes was quite the gentleman in that respect, so got passed, and the president signed it.
So now the clock is ticking, and the SEC has 90 days to name the first board members of the PCAOB. So describe that process to find board members.
The concept in Sarbanes-Oxley, and certainly this is spelled out in the language, is that there would be board members picked who had tremendous reputations, beyond reproach, who had quite a track record of serving the public, who had a knowledge of auditing and the auditing profession. So that's what we were looking for. How you picked them had changed during the drafting process. Initially, it was designed to avoid the politics and use bipartisan, if you will, type people to pick them, like the GAO, not going to part of the administration, because then you got into politics, which I didn't think would work very well. But during this Senate Banking Committee drafting process, that got changed to make it the SEC, Treasury Department, Fed, and so by this point in time, you're very much so into politics and ideology, and that's what got into the final bill. And but the commission starts to go out and look for someone. They approach Paul Volcker. Paul turns them down, probably because Paul had been one of 3 people that had agreed with Arthur Andersen in February of 2002 to set up an advisory committee, monitoring committee to Arthur Andersen when they got in trouble, hopefully to help keep them from going under. And Paul and the other 2, former CEO of Merck and Charles Bowser, had entered into a contract with Arthur Andersen. Andersen had asked Arthur Levitt to do it, and Arthur and I had talked about it just before we testified at the first Senate hearing in January. And I'd advised Arthur that we shouldn't do it because I didn't think Andersen would really agree to do what any such committee asked him to do. And in fact, even though Volcker had a contract, Andersen reneged on that contract. So I can certainly see why Paul wouldn't want to be involved with auditing profession right after that. So then they had to go find someone, and they reached out and approached the chairman of TIAA-CREF, one of the largest asset managers in the country at that point in time, with all the retirement funds of many of the teachers. And
that was John Biggs.
John Biggs, yes. And they reached out to John, and Harvey Goldsmith and Harvey Pitt and their chief accountant at the time, Robert Herman, flew to New York to meet with John and see if he'd be willing to take it. And as Goldsmith told me, The offer was made to John to take the job. John agreed that he would be willing to take it, but he had to have a little time to notify his board and then allow for transition, which was acceptable. And everyone went home from that. And when they got back to Washington, that didn't necessarily, Biggs didn't necessarily go over well with other commissioners or Republicans. John was a Democrat, very knowledgeable, extremely well liked on the Business Roundtable where he was a member. But he was a Democrat, and also, while CEO of TIA Craft, he had instituted a mandatory rotation type requirement, much like what had gone into the first draft of SOX, and the audit firms hated that. So as certain people became aware of that, they then immediately launched an attempt to push Biggs out and go with someone else. By that point in time, the political process was starting to take over, and there was a conversation between a former commissioner at that point in time and one of the former legislative counsels in the office of the chairman of the commission, and that staffer recommended the name of a former FBI director by the name of William Webster. And the then commissioner took that up and ran with it. And the Republicans on the SEC agreed to Webster. Webster had told the chief accountant, though, of the commission of a problem he had had with a company he'd been the chair of the audit committee, U.S. Technologies, that was under investigation for the FBI for fraud. And Webster had fired the auditors who had been asking for more information. But that information was withheld from the two Democratic commissioners. And in fact, then there would be the 5 initial people appointed to the board. The 2 Democratic commissioners would not find out who all 5 were until the morning of the vote in October of 2002. Close to the end of October is when they finally take the vote. I know the information was withheld because I get a call from the Wall Street Journal reporter who's talked to the chairman's office, has been told who they're going to be the night before the vote. I talked to the 2 Democratic commissioners, and they indeed confirmed they didn't know till they picked up the Wall Street Journal article by that gentleman the next morning and find out who the final vote is. So the vote is taken, and it's kind of a 3-2 vote, if you will, with the 3 Republicans on one side, 2 Dems on the other side, in favor of the 5 board members. That's, I think, on a Thursday. On the following Monday, New York Times reporter Steve Labaton, who had actually written an earlier article suggesting that John Biggs had been offered the job, and it was that press article that had caused Harvey Pitt a lot of problems with his fellow commissioners. Steve, on Monday, after Webster had been appointed, called up William Webster and asked him for an interview, which he kindly agreed to do. And Steve went over and interviewed him on Tuesday. And that's when Labaton finds out about the problems at U.S. Technology and Webster's role in all of that. Steve writes it up in an article that comes out, I think it's that Thursday, it's Halloween day. I'm actually speaking at a huge auditing profession, accounting profession conference in Las Vegas, And at 4:30 in the morning in my hotel, my phone starts to ring off the hook. And it's people from the East Coast calling to tell me about this Wall Street Journal, or New York Times, article at that point in time by Steve Labaton and William Webster. And I get up by 7:30, the paper gets delivered to us in Vegas, and it's simply an incredible story and just implodes. And almost immediately, Senator Sarbanes, Senator John McCain, as well as others, then turn around and call for Harvey Pitt to step down and resign, call for William Webster to be replaced. He resigns almost immediately. And it was unfortunate for Webster, who had a fantastic public service record. He told the SEC, had been expressed concern about it. They ignored it. They didn't tell their fellow commissioners. And as a result, there would later on be an investigative report by the GAO, the General Accounting Office at the time, that was not kind to the SEC for the flawed process they'd gone through in selecting the initial board members and the withholding of very, very significant information from members of the commission. And as a result of that, Harvey Pitt did resign then, the morning of the election in 2002, which got a lot of attention in light of all that transpired. It was a terrible, terrible start for the PCAOB, probably a start that became very, very political, and something I don't think that the PCAOB to this date has been able to get out from underneath the cloud of.
The PCAOB does have to start operating, though, and they make a series of critical decisions. And tell me how you feel about the decisions that they made.
They did have to make some critical decisions. One was, would they write their own standards, or as the OMalley Panel had recommended, continue to let the profession draft them, write them, and rely upon that. At the time, myself and two other former SEC commissioners, Walter Schutz, who had run the national office at KPMG, Mike Sutton, who had run the national office at Deloitte & Touche, and myself, all three of us joined together on a letter that we wrote to the PCAOB, urging the PCAOB to write and do their own standards. It was inconsistent given what had transpired with legislation, Oxley versus Sarbanes. Congress had decided on Sarbanes, which gave the PCAOB the ability to write their own standards. It was very inconsistent that the PCAOB would look to the profession rather than writing their own standards. So I think they made the right decision, absolutely, to do their own standards. We'll see if that continues, but that has been a good decision they followed through on. Another key decision was around the area of transparency. And in that regards, the board itself took a vote in which they adopted a policy of not telling the public what audits they had inspected. So when they inspected audits and in fact found significant problems and wrote them up in their inspection report, they refused to tell the public who the company was, which hides very important information from investors who are in many instances required to vote once every year on whether or not to reappoint the auditor. But even though the PCAOB does inspections and finds very significant problems, the PCAOB won't tell those people ahead of their vote that in fact there's been significant problems with the audit. That was a terrible decision. on the part of the PCLB. Keeping that confidential is in no way required by SOX. For a number of years, the PCLB came out and said, well, it's required by SOX, but after they were called on the carpet for that, they then admitted that in fact it was their own internal policy that they had adopted. As a result, there's been legislation introduced on both the Senate and House side that would make the audit enforcement actions, investigations, all public, and that would then lead to the inspections becoming public as well, I believe. So we still have to see that issue run its entire course.
Advisory groups?
Yeah, so on advisory groups, SOX gives the PCLB the ability to set up advisory groups. So initially, they set up two, one that is publicly known and one that is not known to the public. Kind of hid, if you will. The public one was called the Standing Advisory Group, or SAG, S-A-G. It started out probably too big to really be good. It had like about 30 people, and then over the years evolved to like 40 some people. There was issues in that all of the largest audit firms were given permanent seats, but second tier or smaller firms weren't given a voice at the table. That didn't seem fair. And with 40 some people around the table, if you had a one-day meeting, no one had a real opportunity to provide serious input and thoughtful input and have a discussion, debate. So that group, over time, the effectiveness of that group was probably greatly diminished. And then in 2010, 2011, the PCLB set up a second advisory group, I think to somewhat counter the SAG, and that was the Investor Advisory Group, or IAG. It had more of the investor types on it. Representative of investor type organizations were on it. And that provided input, again, once a year, not all that often, but they did provide input. I'm not sure the PCLB acted that much on their advice. They did ask for the audit report to be redone, but in a different fashion than was ultimately done. They asked for other things to be done that were never done. So the effectiveness of the advisory groups, here and there, but probably not what they could have been over time. And I think we've seen the business community and the auditing firms push to eliminate the investor advisory group, and I suspect that that's certainly a possibility at this point in time. The chamber has been pushing and asking for it to be eliminated, but continue to allow the business community and the auditing firms to have a voice. The other advisory group, which was private and confidential, was another group of individuals, such as Chuck Bowsher, professor from Texas, Bill Kenny, who the PCLB board members met with in private. Meetings were never announced publicly, no public agenda. And that was certainly set up initially, but in recent years has for most purpose gone out of business. It was interesting that it was set up though and kept so confidential in the early years, but that was a key decision on how to operate with advisory boards up front.
And then how about the way that the SEC would oversee the PCOB?
Yeah, so in SOX, there is language, and it was anticipated that the SEC would oversee it, much like they oversee FINRA. The commission delegated that oversight to the Office of the Chief Accountant. And the Office of the Chief Accountant, certainly the Chief Accountant and the Deputy Chief Accountants have been captured by the Big Four, to where now staff and partners roll into that office in those positions from the SEC and then are typically returning back to their firms. And so the very people that the PCAOB was set up to regulate are now regulating and overseeing the PCAOB. And that has created a tremendous amount of stress and distrust and a friction that really prevents the process from working the way it should. And early on, when the PCAOB was initially established, the Office of the Chief Accountant was sending over professional accounting fellows who had come from the firms, and it was known they'd be there at the SEC for 2 years and rotate back to their firms. SEC's Chief Accountant Office was sending those over to the PCAOB to oversee it. And a couple of the members of the PCAOB vehemently disliked that, and rightfully so. And as a result of that, the really first chairman of the PCAOB, Bill McDonough, had been head of the New York Fed, quite a reputable person, went to the SEC chairman, Bill Donaldson, and said, this doesn't work. And so Donaldson agreed not to do that. Unfortunately, when Donaldson left, shortly after, Donaldson left, then McDonough left, the PCAOB, new SEC chairman, new PCAOB chair come in, and the new ones revert back to the old policy at the beginning. And it just hasn't worked. There's been this friction, inability to get along, and I think most of that's probably driven by the Office of the Chief Accountant, who is not regulating it. The PCAOB, I don't think, like FINRA, it's regulated it with an extremely heavy hand. And as a result, I think the Chief Accountant's Office has been able to block things that some members of the PCAOB would have preferred to carry out. And have also had a voice in who the members of the PCAOB have become. I think until that is dealt with in some fashion legislatively or from an SEC rulemaking perspective, we're going to continue to see the PCAOB to struggle, because you're in essence got the people who are supposed to be regulated being the ones that oversee the regulators, and that just, the conflict is so gargantuan it just can't work.
For a final question, tell us how you feel the PCAOB has done. Is it an effective regulator of the audit profession?
I think you have to think about that in two parts. The first part is, has the PCAOB done better than the structure that was there beforehand and inside the auditing profession? Has it done a better job of turning out regulations that protect investors? And has the inspections resulted in audits being better? And if not, has it done an adequate job of enforcement? And there's been a whole series of articles or stories recently done by an organization here in Washington called the Project on Government Oversight, or POGO, P-O-G-O, by David Hilsenrath. And it's a fascinating set of articles to read because Hilsenrath was a business reporter at the Wall Street Journal, or at the Washington Post, during the Enron days. And David did a series of articles back then. So here we are 20 years later, and the same person writing a perspective then on how the new body is done. And those have been highly critical of the new body, and I think rightfully so. There are places where I think the PCAOB has done a good job. Their inspections, they got off to a rough start on inspections. They probably weren't very good. They transitioned, got a new director in, and I think that new director took it in the right direction, and they've got better. They still got room for improvement. For example, they recently, we found out in an enforcement action that they found problems with a firm's independence in 2015, but never got it fixed. And it continued, the problem continued for a couple of years before the PCAOB finally stepped in. But the inspection found it. They just didn't get the enforcement done right. So I think on the inspection side, I having been a college professor, I'd certainly give them a grade of a B. I don't think they're an A, but much improvement over the old inspection process where the firms inspected one another. That system, which I oversaw twice when I was at the SEC, didn't function and didn't do well. And we actually reported that to Congress at the time. But so the inspections done okay. The standard setting, probably not very good. The PCAOB adopted the profession's auditing standards right out at the starting gate, which I think they had to do, needed to do. And then they were supposed to revise them over time. They probably only revised about half of them. Even where they've revised them, they've continued a lot of the old guidance, some good, some not so good. So here we are, not quite 2 decades later, and half the standards haven't been updated. So not a very good grade, C-, D+ in this area. Even on some of the standards they've done, they probably still need to do some work. For example, on the new auditor report that the PCAOB did, at the same time a new report was done internationally by the International Standard Setter. Based on the initial disclosures we've seen, the international standard has resulted in much better reports than the PCAOB. So C-, D+. As far as enforcement goes, the PCAOB has been criticized for some time for not taking what they learn in inspections and turning it into credible enforcement action. For example, there's a well-known recent case of a bank that was the largest bank to fail during the financial crisis, called Colonial Bank. And the PCAOB did nothing whatsoever. And yet PwC was sued for their audit on Colonial Bank, and it was a public company, so subject to PCAOB oversight. Nothing from an inspection, absolutely nothing from an enforcement, despite the fact that the TARP Inspector General is the one that found this problem. Just doing a desk review in Washington, D.C., that person found the problem with the audit and with the financial statements of that bank. PwC was sued, and a federal court judge here in D.C. has ruled that, in fact, PwC was negligent with respect to their audit. And yet here we see the PCAOB not doing anything. So, and that's one of several examples. So, and the PCAOB has not used its ability to fine or penalties when behavior is egregious. So all in all, again, probably a D on the enforcement side. Some of this goes back, though, to a problem with the SEC oversight and the fact that the regulated are overseeing the regulator. I think that's as much of the fault here lies with the SEC as perhaps anyone, because I suspect the staff of the PCOB would go a different course than what they're allowed to go on some of this. I think part of the issue goes back to the William Webster and the politicalization of the PCOB. So a lot of the decisions made and in terms of policy at the PCOB, who's on the board at the PCOB, changes that are made in board members and staff at the PCOB are not driven by, as the statute calls for, is this all being done to protect investors and in the public interest, but being driven by politics, which is something that most Americans have a problem with in DC in general. And I think that has affected in a very negative fashion the ability of the PCOB to do its job. Probably at the start for the initial several years, it probably got off to a better start than what the former system was. I think the current system of inspection is still much better than the former system. But after that, there's a lot left to be desired that probably doesn't meet what the initial inspections were. I don't think we need to start over from scratch, but I think there needs to be some fundamental changes in policies and oversight that are done if the PCOB is ever going to achieve what the expectations of Congress were, and Senator Sarbanes, and the public with respect to audits. And the real question is, will it be able to do that before we have another round of Enrons and WorldComs?
Well, thank you, Lynn. Thank you for your time and your insight.
You're welcome.